Hello, and welcome to a new episode of NSPE's Committee Corner. I'm your host, Margaret Edwards, Policy and Advocacy Associate here at NSPE. This week, we're going to take a second look at committee advocacy and kind of talk a little bit more about the how question. How do we as staff members here at NSPE pursue opportunities for advocacy among the committee system? But also, how can you, our NSPE members, be engaged in this work that we're doing? So to begin, if you remember from last time here in the Committee Corner, we brought back this question of why committees and used an example of a piece of legislation that we're actively working on and how we go about advocating for specific legislation and why committees are so important to that advocacy work. But this time, we really want to focus in on the how do we go about finding advocacy opportunities that relate to congressional committees, and then how do we act on those opportunities? What actions do we take? How do we engage you, our members, in that work? So the first place that we start is kind of taking a look at what is happening in the committees in both the House and the Senate. Here we have a list of committees that we regularly follow, whether it is looking at the master committee hearing schedule for either the Senate or the House, and paying particular interest to these committees, or even just looking at the upcoming committee hearing titles, because committees might not be quite on this list, but they're looking at something that is valuable for us to be paying attention to. So if you remember from a few episodes ago, we looked at the Senate Homeland Security and Government Affairs Committee. That is not one that's on our regular reviewing list, but because it was a hearing that related back to natural disasters and kind of how, as we manage emergency response and also preparing for an increasing natural disasters. That's something that piqued my interest as I was looking at it. So then it was an opportunity to review something that might not usually be in our list of committees that we regularly follow. These committees that you see here on the list, part of their jurisdiction, if maybe all of their jurisdiction, relate back to those policy areas that we track here at NSPE, and as well as professional policies and position statements that NSPE has on the record. So that's kind of where we start looking for advocacy opportunities. And so once we see there's an upcoming hearing that is of interest to us here at NSPE or could present us with an advocacy opportunity, we're listening to the hearing, looking for ways that we can kind of wedge ourselves into the conversation. If it's a certain question that a committee member asks, or something that we feel maybe goes unanswered in a committee hearing, or something that even might not be the most immediate part of an issue that a Congress member or our staff thinks about that we want to shed some additional light on. Those are all questions that I ask myself whenever I'm looking at committee activity. Or also another question is there a piece of legislation that NSPE wants to advocate on behalf of or against? And where in the which committee has that piece of legislation where has that piece of legislation been appointed to? And by looking at that, we can then identify key players to then reach out to. And those key players can be key committee members. They can also be sponsors or co-sponsors on the piece of legislation that might also be on the committee. Or if it's a piece of legislation that we're in support of, we might go directly to the committee that the bill has been referred to and start working that membership and asking those members to co-sponsor this legislation to create some noise around it, even if it's not like, yes, give this piece of legislation a hearing, but if committee chairperson sees oh, there's a lot of members on my committee interested in this bill, we should have a hearing on it, or we should have a hearing on this topic. And that's, further ways to keep that conversation going up on Capitol Hill around our issues. So that's kind of like the how. Do we look for opportunities and kind of different ways that we can go about them? But here's a few that I thought of before and ahead of time that I think, these are ways that that we have in the past engaged in committee advocacy and can continue to do so in the future. So writing letters to committees, kind of explaining NSPE's position on an issue or on a piece of legislation, and then ending it with an ask like, yes, we encourage you to consider XYZ as moving forward on this legislation, or we encourage you to vote this bill out of committee so it can work its way through the rest of the legislative process, or move on to another committee that it might have been referred to. So the letters can have various asks, and they're typically addressed to the committee leadership. Another example of advocacy efforts aimed at committees are responding to requests for feedback on legislative language. We talked about this in the first Committee Corner episode that we had, and using a staff draft process on a new autonomous vehicle piece of legislation on autonomous vehicles. And so NSPE, we responded to that with proposed changes, with comments on some of the language, and using that as an opportunity to influence what bill might eventually get introduced into the legislative process. We can create targeted advocacy campaigns. So if you, one of our listeners, has a member of Congress on a certain committee that we want to hear our message, hear something from NSPE, we'll reach out directly to you and to others who have members who sit on a particular committee, and just target those offices, those members with our message, because they are who is going to be acting on a certain piece of legislation first, as being a member of the committee. So it's a way to really target and narrow down and hone in our efforts on a few key members as it relates to a certain piece of legislation. And finally, we can submit written comment to be included as part of the official record on a legislative hearing or in a committee report. One great thing that committees do is report on legislation in the House. Whenever a bill is passed out of committee, there's also an accompanying committee report. And in that, it has all the details of the hearing, but it also includes any other statements that somebody might have submitted to the committee about the specific bill or piece of legislation. So these are some examples that we've either done in the past, or kind of avenues that we can leverage at NSPE to ensure that our voice is heard by key members of Congress up on Capitol Hill. And so, that's kind of things that we can do as staff, as an organization, but kind of coming to you, whenever it comes to you, our members, if you happen to have a member on any of these committees, like on the previous slide, or, any key members of Congress, these are important relationships to build and or maintain. If I were to go in and talk to these members of Congress as a staff member for NSPE, the weight that I carry only goes so far. But if you, as a constituent of these members, that carries a lot of weight and a lot of power that is really important to leverage and hone in. And then whenever a big ask comes up that we are making of specific legislators, and you happen to be living in their district or their state, that's a wonderful opportunity for you to take action. In our advocacy center, if we have a campaign created around the issue, or if you just simply want to call the office and say, hi, I'm a professional engineer living in your district, and I, hope that Senator X or Congressman or Congresswoman Y votes yes on this bill whenever it comes to a vote in the committee tomorrow. There are, so many simple ways for you to start building and, maintaining those relationships with your members of Congress and their staff. And, whenever it comes to the point that we really need something from that member of Congress, we can then, go to you, our members, and ask if you have a good relationship with your member of Congress. And, I would be remiss, it would be missed opportunity if I did not plug the Nspe Advocacy Center. And in the Nspe Advocacy Center, you can view who your officials are under the My Officials tab. And also in that same drop-down menu, you can log a relationship. So if you happen to know your member of Congress personally, or you know a member of their staff because you do a lot of work in your community, or a whole plethora of other reasons that you might have come in contact with your member of Congress or your senators, and you want to share that with us, we want to know. That way, if your member of Congress is a key member in any advocacy strategy or plan that we are moving on or working on, we want you to be involved. So, and the only way that you're going to be involved is if we know that you have these relationships. And so I encourage you to go to the Advocacy Center, check that out. And if you think you have any, key members that might be important for us here at NSPE, please fill that out, log that relationship, and or reach out to us here at NSPE, and we can do our best to help you start to create those relationships and even offer advice on how to maintain them. And we're here to help, and building these relationships is only going to benefit us here at NSPE in the long run. So with that concludes this episode of Committee Corner. We are winding down for the year, and I just want to throw this out there that if you have any questions for us in the Committee Corner, we have a campaign right now in the NSPE Advocacy Center where you can ask us any question, if it's about a piece of legislation or a committee or one of our policy issues at NSPE. I encourage you to participate in the advocacy campaign, and who knows, maybe that question will show up in a few episodes whenever we take some time to answer questions from you, our listeners, to really make sure that we're covering the content that you want us to cover. And if there's any questions from any past episodes, be sure to ask them there, and we'll do our best to answer them in our final episode of 2021. So you can find the NSPE Committee Corner in the NSPE Advocacy Center or on the NSPE YouTube page. Thank you.